In a British archive, inside a collection of old naval papers, someone found a piece of American independence, not the famous parchment in Washington, not the one with John Hancock's enormous signature, not the sacred-looking document that schoolchildren imagine was signed by candlelight while everyone held their breath. This was something smaller, rougher, and in some ways more interesting. It was a printed copy of the Declaration of Independence, made in 1776, just days after Americans declared themselves separate from Britain, and somehow, after nearly 250 years, it was sitting in the United Kingdom's National Archives. That is already strange enough, but the story of how it got there is better, because this copy of the Declaration did not simply travel across the Atlantic as a diplomatic paper. It was carried on an American privateer, captured by the Royal Navy after a chase at sea, sent into British hands as evidence or intelligence, and then filed away so quietly that generations forgot what it was. History has a funny habit of surviving in the places you least expect it. The Declaration of Independence is usually remembered as a single object. We picture one document, one room, one dramatic moment in Philadelphia. But in 1776, independence was not just declared. It had to be distributed. That meant printing. The Declaration had to move from Congress to towns, militias, ships, newspapers, and ordinary people. It had to be read aloud. It had to be posted. It had to become public before it could become memory. The first printed copies, known as broadsides, were working documents. They were not meant to sit behind glass for centuries. They were meant to spread news quickly. They were the breaking news alerts of the 18th century, except they were made of paper, ink, horses, ships, and a fair amount of revolutionary nerve. One of those early printings was produced in Exeter, New Hampshire, then the state capital. Scholars call this type the Exeter broadside. Only a tiny number are known to survive. The newly identified copy in Britain is reported to be one of just 11 known examples, and the only one known to exist outside the United States. That alone would make it important. But this copy has a journey. It appears to have been carried aboard an American privateer called the Dalton A. Privateer was not exactly a pirate, although the distinction could feel a little academic if you were the ship being attacked. Privateers were privately owned vessels authorized by a government to attack enemy shipping. During the American Revolution, they became a crucial part of the war at sea. The young United States did not have a navy that could match Britain's, but it did have merchants, sailors, ships, and a willingness to make the Atlantic deeply inconvenient for British commerce. The Dalton was one of those ships. In late 1776, it sailed into a world where the Declaration was still new. The war was uncertain. American independence was not yet a fact of history. It was a claim being tested by muskets, money, weather, loyalty, fear, and ships at sea. Somewhere aboard the Dalton was this printed copy of the Declaration. Why was it there? We cannot know for certain, but it is not hard to imagine its use. It may have been carried as political proof, as inspiration, as a document to read aloud, or as a reminder to the crew of what they were fighting for. On land, declarations are legal texts. At sea, on a privateer hunted by the Royal Navy, that same paper could feel more like a wager. Then came the chase. On Christmas Eve 1776, the Dalton was pursued by the British warship HMS Raisonnable. According to reports about the discovery, the chase lasted for hours off the Iberian coast. Eventually, the British ship caught the American privateer. The Dalton was taken, its crew was captured, its papers were seized, and among those papers was the Declaration. Think about that for a moment. A document announcing American independence was captured by the Empire. It was declaring independence from. That is the kind of historical irony that deserves at least a raised eyebrow. For the British, the paper was not a holy relic. It was enemy material. It was evidence from a captured vessel. It belonged in a file, alongside letters, commissions, logs, and reports. The British Empire was very good at paperwork, sometimes too good. Things could disappear not because they were destroyed, but because they were preserved too efficiently. So the Declaration copy entered the archive, and there it stayed. Decade after decade, the United States grew from rebellion to republic, from republic to continental power, from continental power to global superpower. The revolution became myth. The Declaration became scripture-like in American public life. July 4th became a ritual of flags, fireworks, speeches, cookouts, and increasingly large quantities of red, white, and blue merchandise. Meanwhile, this captured copy sat in Britain, not lost in the dramatic sense, not buried under a collapsed building, not hidden in a treasure chest, just filed away, waiting for someone to notice it. That someone was a volunteer researcher working through naval correspondence at the UK National Archives, while cataloging papers connected to a Royal Navy captain. The researcher identified the printed Declaration for what it was, a small archival discovery, yes, but also a small doorway into a much larger story, because this paper reminds us that independence was not only debated in Congress. It was carried by printers, sailors, captains, prisoners, and clerks. It moved through taverns and town squares, but also across the ocean. It was read by Americans who hoped it would become true, and seized by Britons who hoped it would not. And it reminds us of something else. Documents do not become famous all at once. In July 1776, the Declaration was dangerous. It was not yet a national shrine. It was an act of rebellion printed in ink. To possess it, carry it, publish it, or fight under its its authority was to take a side in a war whose outcome was anything but certain. That uncertainty is easy to forget from the far side of history. We know the ending. They did not. The crew of the Dalton did not know that the United States would survive. The British officers who captured the ship did not know that the paper in their files would become one of the central texts of a future superpower. The clerk who stored it probably did not imagine that 250 years later, people would care very much about where it had been. But that is how history works. Octags outlive the assumptions of the people who handled them. A cheap printed sheet becomes rare. Enemy paperwork becomes a national treasure. A captured document becomes evidence not of British control, but of American persistence. The timing of this rediscovery is almost too perfect. In 2026, the United States is preparing to mark 250 years since 1776. America 250 will bring ceremonies, exhibitions, speeches, lesson plans, souvenirs, and probably more patriotic branding than anyone strictly needs. And just as the country prepares to remember its founding again, one of the founding documents reappears in the archive of the country it rebelled against. You could hardly ask for a better historical footnote. But the lesson here is not simply that an old document was found. The lesson is that the Declaration was never just one document. It was an idea that had to be copied, printed, carried, defended, captured, misunderstood, filed, forgotten, and rediscovered. It was not born as marble, it was born as paper. Paper can burn, paper can tear, paper can be folded into a packet of naval correspondence and vanish for centuries. But sometimes paper survives, and when it does, it brings back the messy, risky, human world that made the famous words matter in the first place. This copy of the Declaration did not sit safely in Philadelphia. It went to sea. It was captured in war. It became British paperwork. It waited quietly until someone opened the right file, and that is why it deserves to be remembered.